From where you're joining us. A very warm welcome on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Center of Global Development to today's panel discussion, where we will explore the potential of the initiative's Global Gateway and the Partnership for Global Investment and Infrastructure to unlock Africa's sustainable development potential. My name is Thomas Böhringer. I'm the Deputy Head of the Division Analysis on Consulting of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is the think tank unit of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a political foundation from Germany, present with over more than 100 field offices around the world, many of them in Africa. I would like to welcome our speakers for today. Mr. Kyosuke Inada from the European Representative Office of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, Ariana Vanini from the European Commission, Amadou Hott joining us from Gabon from the African Development Bank, Paulo Qua from the Italian Ministry of Enterprises and Made in Italy, and Jude Moore from the CDG, from the Center of Global Development, today joining us from Beijing, China. So Beijing is watching us. Already in 2021, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and the Center for Global Development, we have initiated a series of online events on different aspects of sustainable development. In our event series, we bring together policymakers, lawmakers, officials from ministries, from development agencies, as well as experts from think tanks, civil society organizations on different aspects of sustainable development worldwide. Today's topic, we thought, deserves a public event, a bigger event, and I'm very happy that more than 450 people from all over the world are connected to our online discussion today. We will discuss the financing aspect of sustainable infrastructure development in Africa, with a focus on Africa. According to the African Development Bank, Africa's infrastructure investment gap is estimated at more than 93 billion euro, or about 100 billion US dollar per year. In comparison to that, the Global Gateway Initiative of the EU amounts to 300 billion euro, and PGII to about 600 billion euro, but including Global Gateway. The EU founded Global Gateway in 21, and a year later in 22, the Partnership for Global Investment and Infrastructure was created by G7. The Global Gateway Forum that took place in Brussels 3 weeks ago has shown, after some discussions at the beginning, that the initiative is really slowly gathering momentum. According to the EU, 87 flagship projects have been initiated, and more than half of the overall funding is already earmarked for projects in Africa. And the G7 Partnership for Investment and Infrastructure also appears to be making progress. The initiative was recently discussed at the G20 summit in India, where the US declared an increase of funds. So after many discussions at the beginning, can it really cope with the Belt and Road Initiative from China? Is it mainly old projects with a new branding? Slowly, it seems to gain momentum. However, many questions are still remaining, and we are going to discuss them today. And we are really looking forward to have a closer look to these questions together with our experts. So some housekeeping remarks for today. We are looking forward to answering any questions you might have. To send us your questions for the Q&A after the panel, you have different options. If you stream this event on YouTube or LinkedIn, please send us your questions in the chat. If you are watching the live stream on the website of CGD or Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, please send us your questions via email, and you will find the correct email address below the respective video. So we are looking really forward to taking up your questions for the Q&A. I would, at the beginning already, I would like to thank our colleagues from CGD and from CAS for organizing this event and for doing all the technical and logistical preparations. And I hope everything is working. I will later ask Michaela Gavas, who is the Managing Director of CGD Europe and a Senior Policy Fellow there, to moderate the panel. But before Michaela starts with the panel and introducing the participants, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Kyosuke Inada, the Chief Representative for Europe at the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Mr. Inada, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, thank you so much for having me today on this event. My name is Kyosuke Inada. I'm the Chief Representative for Europe and Head of France Office for Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. So today I'm going to give a little introduction of what Japan and JICA is doing in terms of sustainable infrastructure development in Africa before our panel will discuss on this issue. So JICA has a long history of supporting infrastructure development in various parts of the world. And one of our flagship approaches is what we call the corridor development approach, in which we first develop a regional master plan, followed by development of physical infrastructure and institutional capacity building, which is usually accompanied by support for industrial and social development in the region. In the case of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, we have prioritized 3 corridors on the continent, which are, the first one is called the Northern Corridor, which connects Kenya to Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, and the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo via a single road. Some artisanal road branches into South Sudan is also included in this corridor. And the second focus is what we call the West Africa Growth Wing, which connects the coastal countries of Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Togo, and the landlocked countries of Burkina Faso. And the third and final corridor we focus is what we call the Nakala Corridor, which is in the south, starting from the port of Nakala in Mozambique, which connects to inland Malawi and Zambia. And as you know, Japan is right now the leader of the G7. And when our government hosted the summit in Hiroshima in May this year, our government highlighted the importance of quality infrastructure development in developing countries through what they call the side event on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, hosted by our Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida Fumio. He said that Japan is delivering infrastructure investment around the world, including Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, to mobilize more than $65 billion in infrastructure assistance and also private capital over the next 5 years. And that Japan will work to further promote quality infrastructure investment. Following this G7 summit, Japan and EU held the annual summit meeting in July in Brussels. And EU and Japanese leaders welcomed results over the past year and said that they look forward to further cooperation on concrete connectivity projects under their partnership on sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure. Among the several flagship cooperation projects and activities were the Northern Corridor in East Africa that I just mentioned about, and also the West Africa Growth Wing that will improve trade and transport connectivity in the region. And Japan also has been co-hosting an international conference called the African Tokyo International Conference on African Development, which is now ongoing for more than 30 years. And at this 30th anniversary this year, our president, Dr. Tanaka Akihiko, mentioned that we still need to focus on developing economic corridors through assistance for the construction of ports, roads, and power lines, the usual traditional infrastructure, which can reduce disparities between coastal and inland areas, as well as between urban and rural areas. And since its first announcement in 2005, JICA has been implementing a co-financing facility between Japan and the African Development Bank called the Enhanced Private Sector Partnership for Africa, or EPSA in short. And at the last TICAD, which was the TICAD 8, Japan and the African Development Bank announced that this EPSA will go to the 5th phase, up to $5 billion of co-financing from 2023 to 2025, covering electricity, connectivity, health, and agriculture and nutrition as priority areas. In addition, when JICA hosted the side events on the corridor development approach in TICAD 8, experts pointed out that the environment and challenges surrounding corridor development have changed in recent years due to factors such as the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, which you know very well, and the stricter border controls in response to the global pandemic, and the growing terrorist activities and rising transport-related costs caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So JICA's corridor development therefore needs to be upgraded in response. And today, I hope to hear from the experts on how we can improve not only the infrastructure itself, but also the corridor as a whole to help Africa achieve sustainable development in the longer term. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Inada, for telling us about Japan's infrastructure initiatives and strategies. And thank you, Thomas, for welcoming all of us to this, what I hope is going to be a very interesting conversation. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, let me just say, I think we all know sustainable infrastructure development is really of major importance, both for economic growth, for social progress, but also for environmental sustainability. And in fact, according to a report from the African Development Bank, only 53% of roads on the continent are actually paved. And this is isolating people from access to basic services, including healthcare, education, trade hubs, and economic opportunities. But at the same time, facing liquidity issues, rising debt levels, many African countries are experiencing significant challenges in raising the necessary finance to build infrastructure. And so against this backdrop, and in response to geopolitical challenges, we've heard the EU and the G7 have developed strategies for global infrastructure projects, the Global Gateway in 2021, and then the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the PGII, in 2022. Now, both strategies focus on energy and climate security. They focus on transport, healthcare systems, digital connectivity, and they have projected investments of around 300 billion euros for the Global Gateway, and around 550 billion for the PGII. However, it is very unclear as to the extent to which these two strategies really do complement each other, whether the financing will actually materialize, and how they effectively address the infrastructure needs and priorities of partner countries in Africa. So to help us clarify this, we have four distinguished panelists, which I'm delighted to introduce. Amadou Hott is the African Development Bank Group's Special Envoy and Global Champion for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. From 2019 to 2022, he served as Minister of Economy, Planning and International Cooperation of Senegal. Before joining the government, he was Vice President of the African Development Bank for Power, Energy, Climate and Green Growth. And he's had a long and illustrious career also in the private sector. He worked in investment banking for multiple banks such as Societe Generale, BNP Paribas, ABN AMRO, and the Millennium Finance Corporation. Amadou, welcome to this discussion.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Great. Amadou, if I could start with you, and then we'll come to the other panelists, but could you please briefly outline what the key priorities are for Africa in infrastructure? I mean, in your view, what is it going to take to achieve a fully interconnected Africa?
Thank you very much. We all know, according to the African Development Bank's estimates, Africa needs annually between 130 and 170 billion dollars to fulfill its infrastructure needs. And today the gap is between 68 billion and 108 billion dollars. Whether it is for transport connectivity, digital connectivity, or its access to energy, in particular to clean energy. Africa actually is trying to mobilize both public resources and also the private sector to make sure that these goals of providing access, reliable access, affordable access to infrastructure services is something actually that will happen. And institutions like the African Development Bank are working, have been financing infrastructure for a very long time. In the past, we've seen also European institutions, governments, and also I would say G7 countries by and large supporting infrastructure in the past. But over the last few years, we had seen some kind of focus on other areas, letting partners such as, for example, China with BRI sort of taking a lead in many infrastructure projects. If you look back, infrastructure, let's say rail projects, for example, financed by G7 countries, have been very, very limited. Apart from the, BRT system or the fast train in Senegal recently, you have to go, very long time in history to find those kind of projects. But we see now with PGII and the Global Gateway, we see actually G7 partners really putting hardcore infrastructure at the center of those two major initiatives, and this is a very welcome outcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Dr. Paulo Qua, who is the director of the Division on Research and Analysis. This is the think tank in the Italian Ministry of Enterprise. Now, before this, he had a long career as Director of Research at the Italian Ministry of Defense, and he was also Professor of Systems of Intelligence and Collective Security at the University of Perugia. Paulo, welcome to the discussion. Now, great. So we've heard from Mr. Inada about Japan's infrastructure plans as the current president of the G7. Now, in 2024, next year, Italy will hold the G7 presidency, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has already indicated that the global south will be a key focus, and that Europe must go back to being more present and more cooperative with Africa. Now, what does this mean in practice? And what will Italy, as the president of the G7, do to deliver infrastructure investment in Africa?
Thank you very much. Very happy to be with you. It's correct, I'm directing a think tank in the Ministry of Industry in Italy, but I still speak on my personal capacity in this forum. As you said, yes, Italy is prioritizing in his foreign policy and also in the chairing of the G7 initiative, the need of investment in Africa, especially in the infrastructure field. Italy has its own plan, its own strategy that is unrolling in these same weeks. It will be very soon presented. So this is our national contribution. But since the needs and the challenges are so big, of course, it's we are confident that this is only our political spin to what should be a more European and like-minded countries approach to Africa. There are still a lot of questions around how to facilitate and to exploit the potential growth of infrastructure in Africa, because as we know, there are already multiple projects, some of them drafted at regional level, at global level, at national level, and so the main point, I think, is to benchmark all these different projects and to make sure that they are competitive or complementary and not cooperative, because Africa needs a lot of things, but not the geoeconomic or geopolitical competition among potential donors on different and opposite infrastructure development projects. So this I think is the first idea that we should keep in mind. The second one that I would like to raise is that all these global ideas of different infrastructure projects for Africa and through Africa have a common point, that they end up in the Mediterranean. So we have to think, especially from the European point of view, to Africa as a part or as a continent that is on the Mediterranean, and so the Euro-Mediterranean and the Euro-African point of view is very important, also because the projects that also those who are originating in Asia, so the Eurasian projects that interest Africa, they also arrive into the Mediterranean, because Europe is an important market and an important importer and exporters of goods in the globalization. So this is, I think, these are two very important points. Another one I want to raise very, very fast is that taking the Mediterranean into the picture of Africa, it means also to consider the big issue of the maritime economy, the blue economy, and the development of a system of harbors and maritime logistic also between Eurasia, Africa, and Europe. So this will be basically the hub or the core of many of these infrastructure projects. Another very fast point I wanted to make is that we have to take into consideration that Africa has several challenges, and one of them is the one of statehood. Statehood and governance in Africa should be strengthened in some of countries of the continent. And here we can see a risk of very big infrastructure projects, especially when they are projected outside the continent. That important is that those projects will be an element of strengthening the statehood and not weakening, especially when it's an issue of center-periphery relation or democratization, good governance. So at the end of the game, bringing more infrastructure to Africa, we have to pilot this process in the way that strengthens the statehood and not weaken the statehood, because unfortunately we can also have good infrastructure programs or projects that are that don't bring stability, don't have stability as main focus, and stability should be the main focus. So infrastructure and economic growth should be instrumental to stability, and the key of stability for Africa is good governance and statehood. And finally, last point I wanted to talk is about we saw in 2022 actually a big drop in FDI towards Africa from all over the world. This can be connected to many different factors, but still we have to consider that there can be different up and down in the funding the infrastructure projects in Africa, and this is important that we keep the pace in maintaining a constant growth in investment in Africa. And we also have to remember that Europe is one of the main FDI investors in Africa, so we still bear most of the responsibility of the successful or failure of the infrastructure building in Africa.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paulo. And I want to come back and pick up on some of those points. But first, let me now introduce Ariana Vanini, who is the Principal Advisor for Strategic Foresight and Chief Economist at the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. Before this, she was an economic advisor in the cabinet of Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the EU, and advisor to José Manuel Barroso, the former President of the European Commission. Ariana, welcome. So, Ariana, if I could pick up some of the themes that both our previous speakers mentioned. This is the theme of cooperation, maybe, rather than competition. So with the interventions from the previous speakers, we've learned how the G7 thinks about financing global infrastructure with a special focus on Africa. Now, President Adesina of the African Development Bank has urged for collaborative efforts to investing in infrastructure development in Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about how the Global Gateway interacts with the larger G7 initiative, the PGII, in terms of concrete cooperation with partner countries on their needs and priorities?
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions, and which is key to our policy strategies. First of all, I should recall maybe what Global Gateway is, which is our strategy and our contribution to narrowing the global investment gap worldwide. The previous speaker, Mr. Hott, highlighted how big the gap in infrastructure is in Africa, for example, and really the Global Gateway strategy aims at contributing substantially to close this gap. And it is a value-driven, high-standard and transparent infrastructure partnership, which is based on values. And I should maybe take 1 second to recall what these values are: democratic values and high standards, good governance and transparency, equal partnership, green and clean, security focused, and catalyzing private sector investment. It is a transformative oriented strategy being delivered mostly through Global Gateway flagship. And I'm happy that it has already been acknowledged that the focus on infrastructure is back. Many of these initiatives are actually Team Europe initiatives. So they are a clear sign of a stronger cooperation among EU member states. And as part of Global Gateway, some major investment packages have already been launched, as it has been said already, the 150 billion EU-Africa Global Gateway investment package. Now, of course, to maximize the transformative power that we want Global Gateway to have, we are happy to work with international partners, and indeed, we are teaming up with like-minded partners such as the US, UK, Japan, and Canada in the context of the Partnership for Global Infrastructures and Investment. And I think the best thing I can do is to name one concrete recent example, which is the Lobito Corridor, announced in the margin of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment event that was organized at the G20 in India, with the US joint support to develop these corridors as part of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and at the same time under the Africa-Europe Global Gateway investment package. This is really a concrete example of how we can join forces, not compete, but really build on the same values and work towards the same objectives in a close partnership with partner countries. Now, of course, there are different forms of collaborations, and there is a concrete framework of cooperation, so a concrete forum of the G7 countries to coordinate their effort and leverage resources towards infrastructure investment in partner countries. And I think really stress that the convergence in the agenda and the fact that we want to put the interest of our partner countries at the heart of the identifications of priorities and the planning and design of initiatives and projects is really what both sides are actually aiming at.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ariana, for that. And now let's move to our final speaker, Jude Moore is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works with oversight over the construction and maintenance of public infrastructure. And prior to that, he served as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and head of the President's Delivery Unit. Jude, welcome to you, and thank you for joining us.
No problem. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me, Michaela.
Jude, you're at the moment based in China. Now, for the past decade, the most important global infrastructure plan has been the Belt and Road Initiative. And in the last 3 years, we've seen the EU and the G7 come up with alternative plans, as we said, the Global Gateway and the PGII. What do you think are the benefits of these initiatives as opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative? And where do you think they fall short?
Right. Thank you, Michaela. It's like I said, it's great to be here and to discuss this. I think first, the more the merrier. The amount of infrastructure need, just as Mr. Hart noted, just in Africa alone, the gap is anywhere between 68 and 108 billion dollars a year. So having multiple infrastructure financing schemes and initiatives is better for Africa and other low-income countries and upper and lower middle-income countries in the world. So having PGII, having Global Gateway, that is good because the need for infrastructure is really great. Secondly, it reduces the dependence on a single actor. Right? For, as you noted, over the last 2 decades, the most dominant player when it comes to financing infrastructure across the world, and not simply in Africa, has been China. And that overdependence on China also means that it exposes the countries that are dependent on China to influence in the foreign policy simply because of how overwhelming it is and depending on a single actor. So having Global Gateway and having PGII spreads it around and allows countries to be able to play shop around, as one would put it. But I think there are clear differences here. And one is China, BRI just celebrated a decade, right, from 2013 to 2023. And A-Data at William & Mary published a report recently that said that over the last 2 decades, BRI has spent $1.34 trillion. So the first is scale. BRI is over $1 trillion, and at its peak, Global Gateway will be about a fourth of that, right? Obviously, the time period for Global Gateway is shorter, but just size is different. BRI is significant in scale. At the BRI 10th anniversary, they pledged another $100 billion toward BRI. So one is scale. Second is just speed. There is a clear difference because there is a fusion between the private and the public sector in China, and also because most of the actors, the firms doing the work, are either provincial or state, central government-owned firms. It means that they can move slightly faster than BRI or PGI. Both Europe and the United States are going to use more of their private sector. And so that means that the speed at which they will be able to act would differ from what the Chinese are able to do. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because as I noted before, in terms of scale, there's just not enough money, development money, for the need of infrastructure. For example, if Global Gateway were to use all of its resources in Africa, which is not the case. That's not what it's going to do. It's just a thought experiment. It will simply mean there's enough money for about 3 years of infrastructure financing in Africa, whereas the continent needs up to $100 billion every year for the next decade. So that's just not enough. So because PGII and BRI intend to use more of the private sector, that is good, because they're just way more demand for development dollars than there are development dollars. Afghanistan and the earthquakes there has to be some sort of response to that. Gaza has to be rebuilt after this war. Ukraine has to be rebuilt after this war. And there are other things happening in the world that will continue to make increasing demands on total development dollars available. Meaning at some point for infrastructure to be built in places like Africa and other places that need it, there has to be a substantive and material increase in private sector investment. So PGII and Global Gateway, their intent to leverage the private sector is a good thing. It is just, finally, I would say we're cautiously optimistic that this is going to work. But at some point, one hopes that the template is fixed so that the speed between concept and financial close, concept and first disbursement is reduced significantly, because a number of things are happening. I'm glad that Mr. Hart is here, because his country, Senegal, provides an emblematic example of the kinds of problems we have. Take the Dakar region, which accounts for over 50% of the GDP of the country. And yet that region is water stressed. Over the next 10 years, the next 10 to 12 years, water usage is going to go up by about 30%, and the region is already stressed significantly for water. There has to be significant investment in water desalination, in improving irrigation. All of that is going to require significant amounts of money that may not necessarily be available from the Senegalese public sector, and require the private sector. So one hopes that where the PGII and Global Gateway may not be able to match BRI in terms of scale, in terms of speed, we will see them leverage the private sector in ways, to be honest, that we have never seen before, and one hopes that they will be able to make the difference here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Now, let me just put that question actually to Amadou, if I may. I mean, so Jude talked about both, sort of speed and scale. I mean, Beijing's ability to coordinate and mobilize financiers and investors at speed. I mean, do you think that renders the Global Gateway perhaps less competitive?
Beijing actually so far has mobilized mostly state capital into Africa. The let's say real investments where you're taking a risk to build an infrastructure and maybe have a concession, manage it, get back your returns over 25, 30 years, we don't have a lot of those cases. It's mostly government's funding going mostly into state-owned entities or African governments to build infrastructure at speed, at scale and speed. And if it was not done that way, I think we would not have had the impact and the results that BRI, for example, has today in Africa and maybe some other places. Because structuring private sector transactions through PPPs is much more complex and requires actually investors that are prepared to take some risk. But you need also the local environment, the policies, the framework to be in place. And in many African countries, those frameworks, that regulatory environment, that portfolio, let's say, of potentially bankable projects that the private sector can invest in is not there. That is why actually for green infrastructure, the African Development Bank, Africa 50, African Union, and its partners have set up the Alliance for Green Infrastructure to help the governments put those policies, those programs in green infrastructure and the reforms in place so that you can identify a portfolio of potentially bankable projects where you need to invest development capital, which is expensive, which is scarce as well, so that you can bring those projects to bankability to attract equity investors, debt providers, whether they're from the commercial side or the semi-commercial side from DFIs, and guarantee providers and all the actors to make it happen. And the fact that actually Global Gateway and PGII is trying to galvanize the private sector investment into Africa in infrastructure mainly is something that is great. But if we don't have the project preparation and project development capital and the de-risking instrument that go with it, then it is going to be difficult to achieve the ambition to have the private sector finance infrastructure in Africa. That's why I still believe that the two have to go in parallel, both the public money from our own domestic resource mobilization, from the partner countries, from DFIs, lending money to the public sector to build the infrastructure, quality infrastructure, and having in parallel the strategy to mobilize the private sector into infrastructure. So those have to go hand in hand if we would like to achieve the ambitions, to achieve the objectives. Mobilizing only private sector shouldn't be a panacea. Everybody talks about leveraging the private sector. It is doable, but it takes time. It needs more risk capital to make it happen. And in parallel, the governments would still need to mobilize public money to put it into infrastructure, like it has been done in Europe. It has been done in Asia, and it continues to be done also in Asia and in many parts of Europe. And so Africa must do that. But to do that, we need to mobilize domestic resources. We need to do the reforms. We cannot just rely on donor money. We cannot just rely on private sector. We have to do the reform that we need to do so that our tax to GDP increases. Today in Africa, 2 or 3 countries have tax to GDPs more than 25%. Everybody else is between 7% and maybe 20%. And with that, you'll be limited in terms of public resources that you can mobilize. That's why it's of paramount importance to do the reforms to increase domestic resources so that you can improve your rating, borrow more on the capital market, and also build the infrastructure alongside the private sector, or do PPPs where you contribute part of the money from public sector and part of the money coming from private sector, and then doing those projects together. So let's actually really focus on the two. And lastly, this is the point that I wanted to make in terms of related to FDI's mobilization. Asia is getting richer because the FDIs is focused on industrialization, is focused on manufacturing, is focused on transforming the natural resources and the know-how into value-added products that are exported across the world. In Africa, in 2020, for example, we received only 4% of FDIs and of the global FDIs, and mostly in natural resources, which means then we are just exporting natural resources and we are not adding value. So long as we are not adding value, we will not create wealth, we will not create more jobs locally, and that's going to be a problem. So we need Europe to work with us and other partners to help Africa transform its resources and use the opportunity of this green revolution to utilize our critical minerals and other minerals to add value to them for Africa and then for the rest of the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Amadou. Ariana, if I could come to you, you've heard what Amadou was saying. Firstly, about the problem of the lack of bankable projects, the need for de-risking of bringing public and private money, mobilizing the private sector in particular, and then his comments about FDI. What's your response?
Well, thank you for the question. Generally speaking, I couldn't agree more to what has just been said. And this is why, in fact, the Global Gateway, it's a global strategy, which of course focuses on the financing of big infrastructure, but it also brings other elements like technical assistance and policy dialogue within. And technical assistance focuses on supporting the upskill and local institution upgrading, but also the capacity to improve domestic resource mobilization. There is a lot of work that goes into this direction. And policy dialogue, of course, it's another important element which improves the investment climate, and therefore in the medium term will be able to attract private investment. But it is also clear that the two strategies that are now being compared, the BRI and the Global Gateway one, I think we should stress that the first one, as it has been said, started 10 years ago, and the second one only a couple of years ago. And then they are based, as it has been said, on two completely different models. And not only the value-based element of Global Gateway and its contribution to the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is a key element, but also the private sector dimension, which brings the quantitative element. It has been said that public resources are important, but will never be enough to finance the investment gap. But also the qualitative element. The private sector brings expertise, a very diversified expertise. The European Union has a very solid industrial base and can bring a very diversified offer in terms of expertise. So while focusing, as we should do, rightly so, on the quantitative aspect of Global Gateway, we should not forget that there is a qualitative one, which is, I think, equally important.
Great. Thank you, Ariana. Let me just come to Paulo for a moment. Paulo, this month, the Italian government approved the Plan Mattei. It's Italy's offer to help African nations in areas including education, exports, infrastructure, health, and sustainable exploitation of natural resources. Just tell us a little bit about this plan and what its connection is to both the Global Gateway and the PGII.
Yes, thank you. So, as I told you, the plan is approved in its infrastructure. What is relevant in its execution, it's still to be implemented. But what is relevant at this point that has been known is that Italy is creating a permanent infrastructure to govern this plan. So this is a very important, I think, step, because it has been created, let's call a sort of secretariat of a permanent structure that is going to remain active in time, and hopefully also to remain at the exchange to the government. So it's a strong commitment of Italy to pivot and to direct a part of our cooperation toward the continent focusing on the need to favor the development of Africa. The Mattei plan, in my opinion, is a very ambitious plan because it's linking different dimensions that usually are not considered together. So this, I think, is the main difference with other initiatives, because it's not a functional project that is working only on infrastructure or only on industrial development or on energy, but it includes, it's very ambitious because it includes different dimensions, especially also the one of migration. So the basic idea that goes back to the original idea of Enrico Mattei, that's why the name has been chosen, is that there is a strong connection between energy, industrial development, and migration. So only if you can fix the interconnection of these three dimensions, then you can help Africa to exploit all its potential. But if you miss or misuse, or you don't, you work only on a functional approach to Africa, that you take care only of the raw materials or all your infrastructures or the migration flows, then it's impossible to fix the issue of development. So I think Mattei also arrived to this idea, to this approach, also considering Italy as a case study, because he realized that one of problem of underdevelopment in Italy after the war was connected to the lack of ownership on energy resources, and this was producing a low growth or a poor growth, and this led to historical emigration of Italians from Italy. So the desire of Mattei was to maintain the Italians to work in Italy for the economic development of the country, and he thought this was possible only in having the ownership of or the control or the production of energetic resources. So the strong connection was between energy, defeating the need of people to migrate, to find better economic opportunities, and economic and political development. So this is the main idea, the concept that it is created. That's why I think it's very ambitious, because it means sometimes also to think back or to rethink many of the traditional approach to cooperation to development of Europe or other countries toward Africa.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Jude, let me just ask you, Amadou, do you want to come in before I go to Jude?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I followed with great interest to what Paulo was saying, and I think this is very interesting to see Italy also having a comprehensive plan, in particular to try to help African youth actually basically stay also in Africa, and this is what African governments also want. But I think also on the other end, Italy and Europe should do this for themselves as well, because if Europe deepens its ties with Africa, it helps Africa, but it helps itself, it helps its own youth, because a wealthier Africa, a more stable Africa, a safer Africa represents great opportunities for Europe, for its businesses, and for its people as well, in particular for its youth. We are very close neighbors, and we know all that the next wave of consumers and the next generation of knowledge workers will be coming from Africa, actually. And also the main buyers of European products, of Italian products and services over the next 20, 30, 50 years will mainly come from Africa. That's why this plan of Italy is bold, and we appreciate it, and we believe that it's we're on the right track. Anything that help us industrialize, transform our raw materials, add value, create the jobs locally, I think will really help Africa, help Europe, and help the world.
Great, thank you, Amadou. So you're saying that actually this is in both Europe's and Africa's mutual interests.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks. Jude, let me just come on to you now. I just want to pick up this point about foreign direct investment, and also a question that's actually coming from the audience as well about what the main holdups are to private sector mobilization. So according to UNCTAD's 2023 World Investment Report, I mean, despite an increase in developing countries overall, FDI in the 46 LDCs, least developed countries, fell by 16% in 2022. And that represents actually less than 2% of global FDI. What's going on here?
Well, thank you. I think Amadou spoke to some of those things. One is, a pipeline of bankable projects. In a lot of our environments, you don't have that. Secondly, because of the turmoil in the global economy, there has been a flight into safety, right? I mean, investing in U.S. Treasuries is now profitable. So for global investors, they want to put their assets into safer investment instruments, and so there's been this flight into whether it's the United States or Japan or just industrialized countries where there's significantly more safety in a time of turmoil. There's that, but I think he also spoke to the point about the quality of the regulatory environment. There is a perception of risk. Real and imagined in low-income environments, especially in Africa, that sort of scares global investors, and so that's part of the reason why we're not seeing what we should. And so this idea of investing in that risky project development phase allows us to create this pipeline of bankable projects. But I just wanted to say a few things. One is that when you think of Chinese investment on the continent or Chinese activity on the continent, it has evolved, and that evolution has tracked changes in the Chinese economy itself. So recently at the BRICS conference in South Africa, Wu Peng, who represents China on the continent, noted that African heads of state had reached out to their Chinese counterparts to say it wasn't enough to simply do infrastructure. They want now more industrialization. And in his speech, or in the speech from the Chinese president that was read by the commerce minister, he acknowledged that and said that China will respond to that. Recently, there were meetings here in Beijing in preparation for FOCAC, and that is a big part of it now, that China will support industrialization in Africa. So we're seeing an evolution in the Chinese relationship there. That's the first thing. The second thing is, at the BRI summit here, the 10th anniversary, was an emphasis that BRI going forward will place an emphasis on an elevated role for the Chinese private sector. So for example, if you went to Kenya today, from the airport to the central business district, there is an expressway that's toll road that's built on a PPP between a Chinese firm and the Kenyan government. The idea is that BRI is going to take that note, that Chinese firm or private sector is going to take a more elevated or a heightened role in the BRI. So even in the areas where PGII and Global Gateway have their strengths, which is leveraging the infrastructure, we're beginning to see the Chinese investment or Chinese engagement begin to edge in that same direction. This is a good thing. A focus on industrialization is a good thing. The final thing that I want to say is about the migration issue. And I hope that European policymakers are not promising European publics that investment in Africa and the expansion and economic growth in Africa will immediately halt migration. Because if you look at Michael Clemens's research, normally as the economy of those countries begin to get better, people have more and more resources to leave. So there is an uptick in people migrating, and then eventually it begins to, so that European voting publics do not become more frustrated, because as the economy gets better, they begin to see more and more migrants. We believe, however, that there is a mismatch here. In Europe, the median age is rising. Europe is getting older, whereas in Africa is significantly younger. Something will have to drive a more competitive European economy, and that takes younger workers. That happening. There has to be a workable solution in which there is an orderly migration from Africa to Europe that benefits both Europe and Africa. So I think if the European plan is basically to become a fortress and build this wall, and we're going to build the economy in Africa and nobody's going to move, I do not think in the long term that works. My hope is that there is a mutually beneficial opportunity here, both for the continent, but also for Europe. And so to Amadou's point, Africa's expansion, the growth of its consumer class is a benefit to Europe, or just as much as it is to us. For the last 20 years, it's been Chinese growth that has driven this. For the next 20 years, it might be India, it might be Africa, but there is a possibility here for a mutually beneficial arrangement that is for both Africa and Europe. And stop there. Sorry.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Jude. Ariana, I'm going to come to you now.
Yeah, well, a lot of very interesting questions. I wanted to start just with the investment issue, the foreign direct investment, and the fact that indeed it's very risky to invest for private sector to invest in some countries. I should maybe recall that this issue, of course, now became more serious, but has been there for quite a while. And this is what brought the European Commission in 2017 to the adoption of the EFSD, with its free pillar, which was a fund to de-risk investment, a guarantee fund to de-risk investment, and a second pillar on technical assistance, and a third pillar on policy dialogue. So this is where we do come from. This is a bit the history of where we are now. And of course, meanwhile, we had a couple of more serious problems which have not helped the situation to improve. But the idea that private investment should have been somehow helped through a de-risking mechanism has been there for, I would say now at least 6 or 7 years. It evolved into a more sophisticated instrument, which is the FSD Plus. I'm sure you're all aware about, whereby implementing financial institutions, the EIB, the BRD, and the National Promotional Bank, but also multilateral banks, can ask us the guarantee and channel it through local financial institutions to finance bankable projects. Which do exist, and the recent Global Gateway Forum, you may also be aware, it was mentioned in the opening of this conference that was organized here on the 25th and 26th of October, so just a couple of weeks ago, putting together heads of state and government of partner countries and some European Union member states with CEO in the private sector, really showed that there is this matching is taking place. And I really think now there is a momentum for this, on which we are building very, very seriously with a lot of hard work. On Africa being a resource, of course, we couldn't agree more. Africa is not a problem to solve, but actually a partner to work with, and also to help in developing its own independence in somehow. We know that Africa is not one continent. It's made of different partners with different specificities. And Europe is, through Global Gateway, also helping partner countries to become more independent. Let's take the example of the vaccine manufacturing, which will be built in Senegal, for example, which is a very, very important step towards some sort of health independence. We have seen how important it is to be able to develop vaccine and in the future also pharmaceuticals at a local level. This is what the European Union is trying to do, and this is what the European Union is helping partner countries to do as well. And certainly, it's a very important market because it's a young population. It is one of the faster growing population in demographic terms, together with Asia. Not sure now it's growing faster, but certainly both are growing much faster than Europe. And at the end of the day, the most important resource is people. So the human resources aspect will be key in any growth strategy. And this is also why, although Global Gateway is very much focused on infrastructure, it also builds on education. Education is one of the priorities of our Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen. She's really devoting a lot of efforts to make sure that education picks up. And we have several initiatives already signed with partner countries in Africa. I can name some that came up in the Global Gateway Forum, with Rwanda, for example, and with Somalia. So we are invested in human capital as well. And should I say a word on migration? We know this is a very complex matter. This is something that is very articulated and touches upon different sensitivities, but in economic terms, I couldn't agree more with what Jude just said. It's the resource that counts. So I really think that we will find a good way to help the continent to grow at the benefit of the continent itself and of Europe, because we are totally interlinked, and that is something that I think now is clearer than ever.
Great, thank you, Ariana. Let me come to some of the questions now that have come in from our online audience. So there's a question from Thomas Pohl. He's asking, what are your views on how to align the need for donor cooperation with the need to leverage the competitive spirits of private sector investors and developers in order to close the infrastructure gap in Africa? So, aligning the needs of donor cooperation with the need of leveraging the private sector. Can I ask Amadou to take that one?
Thank you very much. Before I take that question, very quickly on what Gide said, actually finding a win-win, whereas the African youth somehow sort of can be allowed to work in Europe de facto. I just want us to be careful that all our best people don't go actually to Europe and let the country, let our countries actually without the expertise that we need also to develop. That's really fundamental. And on what actually Ariana was saying actually on guarantees, I think with the Lobito corridor, we have here a concrete example where the European Union can quickly use its guarantee instrument to make that project happen. It's a major impactful project for that part of Africa and for those countries. And also we have next door the INGA project. INGA could transform the energy landscape in Africa. The European Union would plan, let's say, for $75 billion or more over the next 7 years in Africa, and this is pure grant money. Can we say, let's take 10 billion out of that 75 and put it in INGA as guarantee instrument, as soft financing, as grant money, to make sure that INGA takes off? Because the return for Africa and for the world will be really, really huge. And on the question actually of Thomas, if I understand it correctly, when you say donor cooperation, you mean here all donor countries, not just the G7 donor countries. Are you including also, China and other emerging countries that are de facto somehow also donor countries? But what's important is really to make sure that when Africa is dealing with the private sector, that it has actually transfers of skill, it has the quality of infrastructure, it has the speed of execution and structuring. We don't want to spend 10 years structuring a project with the private sector. The train would have left the station. And number 4, fair transactions, where the returns of the private sector are linked to the real risk that the private sector is taking, not to the perceived risk. When you're doing a PPP project in Africa, the private sector investing want all sort of guarantees. If it's a toll road, you need traffic guarantees or some subsidy from the government. You need this or you need that, and you need some PRG. You take out all the risk, and still the private sectors, in some cases, still want the higher double-digit returns. If you have taken almost all the risk, the return should go down. It should be in line with returns of projects that are no longer risky. And that's a major issue. You do an IPP, you ask for PRG, you ask for this, you ask for that, and then you still want 17% IRR when in fact almost all your risk has gone down. I think we need to have some discussions around that, but definitely donor countries, the soft money you have, the guarantees can definitely help, leverage private sector resources. I was not sure about the question. That's why I hope that Thomas, my answer, takes us somewhere.
Thank you, Amadou. Jude, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond on the migration question a little bit because they're very strong views on this in terms of brain drain and the amount of skilled labor the continent needs itself to. And I always like to use Kenya for the example here. The largest export out of Kenya is tea. In 2022, Kenya made $1.9 billion from its tea export. But in the same year, Kenya received $4 billion in remittances. So the largest foreign exchange earner for Kenya in 2022 was labor. I honestly think that is a possibility for us here in Africa. Our total receipt in remittances in that year was 96 billion, and our total in receipts for development aid was like 45 billion. So if there is a need to create at least 12 million jobs annually, and we're creating only 1 or 2 million formal jobs, that excess labor needs to go somewhere. And so if it is skilled enough, so that, and this is where our recommendation at the Center for Global Development in global skills partnerships, that allows the receiving countries and the sending countries to work together to train enough so that regardless of how many leave, there's still enough there to continue to build and work on the development plans of the country. I think there is a possibility here. And to the point that you were making, I know that when we think about development partners, we focus on Europe, the United States, and China. But we're seeing that just recently, African leaders went to Saudi for a conference. Then Saudi is actually elevating its role as a partner here. Turkey is actually a big partner. And 2 years ago, Turkey dropped one of its requirements so that it make it easier for African students to go to Turkish universities. We're seeing other emerging actors on the continent outside of Europe, the United States, and China. And that is a good thing. That in Washington, there's always this talk about the United States being Africa's partner of choice, and I always try to push back to say Africa doesn't need a partner of choice; it needs a choice of partners. So we want as many partners as possible because the scale and scope of the continent's challenges are beyond what any one partner can provide. And so I think to this point of coordination among the donors, that is going to rest with African governments themselves in terms of how to work with the donors and streamline and cooperation among the donors.
Excellent. Thank you, Jude. And now, let me put something to all of you now. Just going back to the Global Gateway specifically. So in 2005, the then European Commission President, Jose Manuel Barroso, he unveiled the EU strategy for Africa. Then in 2018, President Jean-Claude Juncker launched the Africa-Europe Alliance for Sustainable Investment and Jobs. And here now, in 2021, President von der Leyen launched the Global Gateway. Okay, so we have a succession of sort of initiatives. Now, last year, during the EU-AU summit, Senegalese President Macky Sall said of the EU-AU relationship, and here I quote, he said, "Often we, as in Africans, were not listened to. We were just given recipes, solutions, but this summit marked the starting point of a new partnership based on mutual respect, solidarity, and mutual listening." So let me ask each of you, do you believe this time is really different? That the Global Gateway is really the start of a new partnership, which actually does respond to what Africans on the continent are saying? So let me start with you, Ariana, if I may.
I would have hoped to be the last one. No, but I'll go with it. Well, of course, yes. I think what has happened meanwhile, it has been really a shift in the paradigm with which we interact with our partners. And because symbol and form sometimes are the best way to reflect the substance of a change, I should start by pointing out that the current commissioner is called the Commissioner for International Partnership, and the structure that support her, to which I belong, is also called International Partnership. And this is not by chance. The shift has been to work with partners, not in the context of purely development cooperation mindset, but through a dialogue whereby the partners identifies what are their priorities, and the European Union matches it with its own priorities that are green and digital for since the beginning of this Commission mandate. Mainly, well, of course, it's not only that, because we do many other things. We do education, we do research, but let's say that the two big streamline are green and digital. But the dialogue that took place with partner countries in making sure that both, let's say, interests were taken into account, I think it is unprecedented. But it mirrors a change in the approach, a change in the culture. These are things that take time. All changes take time. But I do think that really now with Global Gateway, we have come to, as I said before, a point where we do have a momentum where we can really work together to scale this up.
Thank you, Ariana. Jude, over to you.
Sure. Well, I hope so. I'm cautiously optimistic. When I was a graduate student in DC, I went to an event at the Cato Institute, and then President Wade of Senegal was speaking at Cato, and he said that this has to have been like the early 2000s. And he said, Years ago, when we in Africa wanted to do anything, we had only two options. We go to Europe or we come here to Washington. And with Europe and Washington, they always acted in concert. They gave us instructions on what to do, and that was it. Now we can go to Beijing. This was President Watt. And so the rise of China changed the dynamics by China providing an outlet and an option. But I also think beyond that, I just listed the other actors, new and emerging actors that are active on the continent now. But I also think the war in Ukraine has changed the balance in international affairs. I think an active war in Europe and this push where there's a push from the West to isolate Russia because of that. And across the developing world, even in Africa, that we saw sort of a resistance to simply go along with that. I think it means that now in dealing with the rest, there is emerging, say, an independent foreign policy. And so Europe has to gauge and recalibrate how it deals with its partner. That's just Africa. This is everywhere. I think what's happening in Gaza is also going to contribute to that. And so there has to be some sort of structural change. The second thing is COVID and COVID-19 and the response to that, hoarding of vaccines and what happened as the world responded to that sort of affected these relationships. So I think, it is in Europe's best interest that this relationship takes on more of a partnership. And as Ariana noted, we're seeing structural changes within the European Commission itself, that the unit is actually called international partnership. That itself is an indication that Europe is, moving in a different direction. The final thing that I would say, though, is that it is not enough for Europe alone to change. I think African partners who are engaging with Europe will also have to adjust in how Europe, the United States, China, Saudi, they're all partners. Africa itself has to take ownership and lead this, and then the partner can join, because partners are not going to develop Africa. Africans are going to develop Africa. So the leadership itself has to come from the continent, and then the continent can engage its partners as equals or as peers.
Super. Thank you, Jude. Amadou, you've got the final word on this.
Thank you very much. I couldn't more than agree with Jude here and also Ariana. But I will say that I'm optimistic in one hand, and on the other hand, maybe cautiously optimistic. Optimistic when I see, for example, today on Global Gateway, having hardcore infrastructure, the rails, the roads, the ports, the airports being part of this global gateway, where now Europe would say, we want to demonstrate to Africa that we can, quote, do a bit like what others do, meaning building hardcore infrastructure so everybody can see it. The populations, when they see a road, when they see a rail, they believe in it, they see it, they see that this comes through a partnership, right? And Europe now is saying, I want to do the same, and that's very positive. And they've been listening to Africa, because Africa has been saying human capital is important, health, climate is important, but the hardcore infrastructure that will help us power our economies is also very important. And I think Europe is listening. But when Europe takes certain decisions without discussing with partners like Africa, for example, having the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it penalizes African companies that are already not very competitive coming to Europe. With the CBAM, will become even less competitive. So it would have been nice to have a discussion up front and say, we want you to industrialize, we want you to export to Europe, we want you to grow and create jobs in Africa. We are planning to do this. How can we make it less painful? How can we prepare Africa also so that our economies would still have access to the European market without paying too much? For example, if you look at also in the, if you look at also, for example, in climate, there have been some decisions made in the past at one of the COPs in Glasgow, where it's a big decision to no longer finance fossil fuel overseas, whereas Africa has 640 million people without access to electricity, without any discussions that made some African leaders rightfully actually say, hey, what's going on? You're financing fossil fuel in your own economies. We need power. We're starving for electricity. And you say you're not going to support fossil fuel without having the right discussions, without explaining that, if a country want to do, let's say, a JET-P, for example, maximizing renewable energy, here are resources that are available that we can support you so that your tariff is not too much. Africa should do renewable energy, but the poor Africans should not pay if the cost is higher, right? Somebody has to foot the bill. Somebody has to help. This is partnership. And I think this is now understood. We are on the right path. That's why I'm cautiously optimistic until I see it really be realized. And lastly, on partnership with the with the EU, the partnership shouldn't be only with the countries. We need companies in Europe, SMEs, to partner SMEs, companies in Africa to share the wealth created in Africa and have the transfer of skills that we need to tool up Africans so that tomorrow we will be also to create wealth and export as well. So having more partnership between the companies, our SMEs and your SMEs, transfer of skills, I think that would really help show to the Africans that this partnership is win-win. It shouldn't be only government to government. It has to be with the people, with the private sector, so that the Africans themselves, they see themselves into this overall partnership, and it will be a win-win for everyone if you do that.
That's excellent. Thank you, Amadou. Ariana, I believe you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just I see we have 3 minutes, but I'll be very quick. One point on the fact that the changing culture was pushed by external events. I have to say that Global Gateway dates back to December 2021, and the war in Ukraine started in February 2022. So the culture was already there. The cultural change was there, was accelerated by COVID, was accelerated by what happened afterward, but it was already on the move. On the CBAM and the legislation, I could also add the forest regulation, which is also another topic, another hot topic. We are aware and we are working to, let's say, improve our way to factor in the impact that EU policy legislation has on partner countries. So also I wanted to insert this additional optimistic element in the discussion, that at least for the future, the voice and the interest and the impact, whatever Europe does on partner country, will be factoring at the start, at the beginning of the decision-making process, and not only at the end. Thank you.
One quick one there on the CBAM, Ariana. A quick win would be to dedicate part of the resources that the CBAM will generate for Europe, not just to increase the coffers of the European governments, but take some of it and send it to the countries that are affected so that our industries can really adapt and do the investments and then become more competitive.
Should we take that under advisement?
That's excellent. Very nice concrete proposal. Brilliant. What can I say? Thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. I'm sure we could continue for another couple of hours.
I can go to sleep.
Yes, given it's like past, what is it, coming up to 11 there.
11:30 in Beijing, yes.
Yeah. Let me just, pull out some of the things very, very quickly. Big sound bites. More is better. That's certainly a key one. emphasis on mutual interests, importance of leveraging the private sector, both European and African, through de-risking, technical assistance, focusing on the sort of quality of the business regulatory environment, and then structural change needed from both continents, Europe and Africa. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I wish you pleasant rest of your day or night in the case of Jude. Thank you very much.